Okay, well, for those of you who have joined us, welcome to Tmap, Building Environmental Literacy at a Distance. We're all thrilled to be here. I'm going to be driving the slideshow, so I'll be sharing my screen for a large part. But there at the top of your screen, you probably can see your presenters. Myself, I'm Greg Corrett. I'm the Director of the Media and Accessible Design Lab, the LightHouse in San Francisco. Steve Lowry, you want to introduce yourself? Does everyone want to just say hi real quick before we dive in?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I am a TDI and O&M instructor at the Washington State School for the Blind and a happy and enthusiastic Tmaps user.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer, and I am a orientation and mobility instructor here at the LightHouse. Good to see everyone, and welcome.
And hello, I'm Sarah McIntyre. I am also an O&M instructor at LightHouse for the Blind in San Francisco.
As is Kat Jones, who's doing an Able Assist running. She's our engineer in the background today.
And some tech support.
Yes, and for brokering this whole thing, making it happen. Thanks, Kat. So let me share the screen. I'm going to get over to my PowerPoint and just start talking through stuff. Let's see. You should all be seeing my screen and me. So today, what we're going to be going over, I am going to introduce you to Tmap, to the web app itself that's used for generating tactile map files. And then we're going to hear from these three O&Ms. We're going to hear their perspective, their insights, using Tmap with students. A lot of good information there. And well, I guess Jennifer will talk a bit about some practical tips for creating the maps, customizing the maps. Sarah has some case studies to share, and Steve has an emphasis on prerequisite skills for map reading if you need to bring your students along with some basic concepts. And the other thing I'll mention is that here at the LightHouse, Jennifer and Sarah work primarily with adults, and Steve works primarily with kids. So Tmap, I should tell all of you what this is. I suspect many people have at least heard rumors about this. Tmap is Tactile Maps Automated Production. It is a web app to quickly create tactile street maps. These are maps that work best at about the scale of a neighborhood, anywhere from 1 to 2 blocks, to potentially 1 to 2 miles, depending on the scale and the size paper. And they show streets, pedestrian paths. My slide says buildings. That's actually been disabled temporarily while we fix a bug with that. And this is automated in the sense that you don't have to design these maps or make them from scratch. And I suspect that many people on this call have at one time or another taken pains to create their own maps for students. So you know how involved that can be. And this Tmap can be a real time saver. And finally, the way this works, it's a web app. It runs in your browser. You type in an address. You eventually basically download your file. And from that, once it's on your computer, then you can actually print or emboss it. Why Tmap? Well, because blind and visually impaired communities have little to no access to information that helps them learn about their surroundings. Certainly not to any of the visual aids that sighted people take for granted, maps in particular, which are fairly ubiquitous. And I'll mention that especially this past year, O&Ms and TVIs have been finding Tmap to be an effective tool for teaching spatial development, roots, developing tactile reading skills, you know, in lieu of or as a supplement to in-person teaching, which has, you know, pretty much been put on hiatus for quite a while now. So you'll be hearing more from these O&Ms that are on the ticket today about how they are actually using this that way. So a quick overview, I'm gonna do a live demo of this thing, but just so you know what to look for. The Tmap web app, when we get there, the main attribute is a search bar. You can enter an address, a street address, you can enter an intersection, you can even type in a landmark. It uses Google search to verify results. So even if, you know, there are typos that you don't have a complete address, oftentimes Google will figure it out or give you some options. And then there's the create map page. And this is where you decide your settings, you know, the size paper you want to use, the orientation of the page, you know, whether landscape or portrait. You choose your map scales, which has a lot to do with how much detail, the complexity of that map. Your distance units, whether metric or English. Your features, what to include on that map. Streets is the default, but of course there are also service roads, railways, pedestrian paths. And there's a Mapbox Viewer that I'll be talking a little bit about. That's the visual preview that helps you orient the map so that when you print it out, you get exactly what you are hoping for. The actual file preview, and then finally discussion about downloading an email. So this is a screenshot of the Tmap landing page, but I'm actually going to toggle over to my browser, and this is the actual thing. It's a very simple page, screen reader friendly, by the way. Before I dive in, I just want to draw your attention to some of those things listed at the bottom. More info, guide, the FAQ, order. I even remember what's in more info. Basically, these are links to resources at on the LightHouse website about Tmap. I should just click on it and remind myself what is over here at more info. Yeah, it's kind of a homepage about tactile maps. So this is like the list of all the resources, frequently asked questions, how to use Tmap to make maps, printing instructions. So much more granular and detailed than what I'm going to be able to address today. But just so you know that those things are there for you. So let's just dive right in. I am actually going to enter LightHouse for the Blind, Visually Impaired San Francisco, because I'm familiar with that map, so it's very easy for me to talk about it in a demonstration mode. So what we have here, notice that the search term at the very top has been converted in the upper left to an actual street address, 1155 Market Street. This is what is going to appear in ink print and or Braille on the map itself when you print it out. The features I mentioned, there's a series of buttons. Streets is checked by default. You can also click on service roads, which would include things like alleyways. Very useful for campuses, for schools and the like, places where primarily it's pedestrian use, but service vehicles and the like might be allowed, but not main roads. You'll also find them in, let's say, housing developments, apartment complexes, pedestrian paths, which we'll talk a bit about. That actually can be a catch-all, meaning it could be bike paths, it could be pedestrian paths, it could be hiking trails, things of that nature, but essentially it means cars don't go here. And railways is also a catch-all. It could be basically if it's elevated, if it's above the ground, whether it's light rail or freight, or here in the Bay Area, we have BART, that will show if it is an above ground feature. We have our paper sizes. The default is our standard Braille paper, the 11-inch square that we're all familiar with. There's also letter size and tabloid as well. And then map scale. I have a hard time speaking intelligently about map scale because I don't quite understand these divisions. But if I'm going to zoom in for demonstration, I'm going to, whoops, I went the wrong place. Clicked the wrong button. Let me drill back down. 1 to 1500 is the most zoomed in. And on this map, that looks like it represents about 2 solid blocks, 2 city blocks. 1 to 2500, as we can see, is probably giving us more like about 3 to 4 city blocks. 1 to 5000, as we're zooming out, we're getting more of the neighborhood. You also notice that the maps potentially get more complex. And then finally, those are the scales I tend to use in urban areas. Once you start getting to 1200 to 2500 or 50,000, if you were to emboss that map 1 to 50,000, that would probably feel like a plate of spaghetti. That can be very useful in rural areas, however, where there aren't a lot of roads and streets. So for our purposes, I'll leave it at our default of 1 to 5,000. And of course, distance units, take your pick, feet or meters. This, by the way, this is the Mapbox previewer. It shows you a version of the map, kind of realistic to what you would actually get if you embossed. It doesn't, the previous version had an actual Google map picture, which is not at all realistic because it just has way too much information and detail. This is attenuated to only show those features. It does have the grayed out buildings, which would not appear in your map, but that's just kind of as a placeholder. So let me just check a few boxes. I'll check them all. And I'm going to click Create Map. And this should take us, if I actually click the right button, looks like it's thinking. We're now on the download map page. And there you can see on your screen, that is an actual image of our tactual map. And I'm going to talk about these maps. We're going to go through them a page at a time. You can choose to download it to yourself, or you can actually email this. So maybe you don't have an embosser or a swell machine, but you know someone who does, and they'll print this out for you. You can just email them the file. So I'm going to click download. And what I'm downloading is actually a zip folder containing these files. I'm just going to extract. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I forgot. Oh, no, you should actually be able to see this. You can see my screen, yes?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, all right. Earlier on, I had made a mistake, and I just got scared that I might have, by switching apps, you wouldn't be able to see what I'm doing. We are looking in that zip folder are SVG files and PDF files. For the most part, I think everyone's going to find the PDF files easiest to use. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. The PDF is actually 4 pages long. Page 1 is the Braille and tactile artwork. Page 2 is the visual equivalent. Page 3 is the Braille page of the legend or key. Page 4 is the visual equivalent. So about this map, And actually, I'm going to switch over to the print view because it's a little easier for me to talk about. As I mentioned, the address always appears in the upper left. That's the title of the map. And that is associated with a locator dot. In the middle of this map is a raised circle when you emboss that. So that lets the map reader know where on this map that address is. So that's a key way to orient themselves. You'll notice too that anywhere streets meet the edge of the map, they receive a label identifying the name of the street. You may also notice that these are abbreviations. The reason for that is that Braille is a pretty large font and it takes a lot of space. So in order to not clutter the map, we confine all the labels to the edge so they're not dropped down in the middle of your artwork. And so that they fit in the margins, we have these short abbreviations. And that's where the legend or key is useful because it will spell out the full names. So I happen to know the 1155 Market, that raised circle in the middle, that's the address of the lighthouse. I know that solid lines are streets. The fine dotted lines are pedestrian paths. And that's a big plaza across the street from the lighthouse offices in San Francisco. And the dashed lines, that's actually the light rail. That's the F line that runs up Market Street. And then of course, I know all of these streets. HYD is for Hyde Street, LVN is for Leavenworth, MRK, Market. Notice in the upper right, we have a scale. So this shows us that 250 feet is approximately, that's about an inch long stripe. That's a raised line. So people can feel and gauge these distances for themselves. And we always have a compass rose pointing north, this end up, so people can better orient themselves. A quick look at the key itself. So the raised circle, which shows the street address, a street, which is this line, pedestrian path I've mentioned, the texture for that, the texture for railway, and then all of these abbreviations spelled out in their full. So FLT for Fulton Street, GRV for Grove Street. I noticed too that the direction that the street runs, whoops, I did not mean to do that. Northwest to southeast, east to west, north to south. That can also help as an aid to orientation. Sorry, I clicked on that and I did not mean to. How do I get my full view back? Well, I'm not going to worry about it. And I think some of our instructors may talk a bit about that. So let me switch back to this PowerPoint. There we go. So we already looked at that. Let me just mention some things if you're already thinking about what you want Tmap to do for you. Tmap is designed to be very simple and to create as much as possible an uncluttered map. A lot of times people desire other features and symbols. They want to drop in bus stops. They might want to depict water, textures, things of that nature. And we don't have all of that built in because you can very easily create an illegible map. So we are still trying to confine it primarily as a street map tool. So it's not fully customizable within the app itself, but Jennifer will be talking about some tips and tricks for customizing Tmaps. So you can't do it within this app, but you could work on those PDF files in another app, or you could just customize your maps after you print them, whether with puff paint or wiki sticks, bump dots, etc.
Hey, Greg.
Yes.
Cut you off really quick. Can folks in the chat see the screen right now?
Say that again.
Can folks in the chat see what's going on the screen right now? I'm getting one person saying they're not seeing the presentation, or sorry, hearing the presentation anymore. Everybody see the screen and hear Greg. I'm seeing some yeses coming in. Okay, so the person that's having some technical issues might just be on your end. Okay, thank you.
Oh, thanks for checking it. Yeah, my screen does say I'm sharing and all that, but I'm happy to refresh if I need to.
Okay, I think you're.
And OpenStreet, we're pulling data from OpenStreetMap. So we're not we can't do floor plans, we can't do transit maps, labeled campus maps, meaning you'd want labels on buildings on a campus. Tmap won't do that by default. And it's not working at the scale of, political, geographic, city, state, world map. Again, it really does work best for localized wayfinding and orientation at the scale of a neighborhood. So if somebody wanted a map of their city, Austining, New York, or what have you, Tmap would be good for the area around their home, around their school, their job, new neighborhoods they want to go visit, and they want to figure out how to get from point A to point B. But it wouldn't be practical to, let's say, map an entire town with Tmap, not likely. This is an important one, Tmap distribution, how to get it. Some of you may know, but you can request a free Tmap user account. To request a user account, simply email us tmap@lighthouse-sf.org. I'll put all this into the chat when it's no longer my turn to talk, and you can fetch that later. I also have a link to some resources you can download if you like. For those of you who don't have the means of production, who don't have access to, let's say, a Tiger embosser or a swell machine, you can purchase Tmaps at adaptations.org. That's the Lighthouse's online store. Basically, when you place your order, you supply the addresses you would like maps of. And what we actually do is send you a couple different scales of the same address so that you will have, let's say, a simplified zoomed in view, as well as a maybe more complicated but more detailed view that encompasses a bit more real estate. And maps ship for, I believe it's $25 per an order. So you're getting 2 maps, both with their own keys. And there's a cover sheet that helps to orient both yourself and your students to the Tmap, how to approach reading a tactile map for the first time. Much of the stuff that I've gone over, I'll just encapsulate it in a kind of one sheet. And finally, customizations and or bulk orders. I mentioned at the beginning, I work for the MAD Lab at the Lighthouse. That's the Media and Accessible Design Lab. From time to time, people do request maps that are not just out of the box. The Tmap is almost what they want, but not quite. They may want a more detailed map of a college campus, let's say, and we can oftentimes help with that work. That is fee-for-service work, but we're happy to meet you halfway and work with you. And we've also done bulk orders too for guide dog schools, for conferences, when we were all meeting in person and a lot of people would descend on one town and need to orient themselves to a new downtown. These were a popular item. And for, any of you who teach in more institutional settings or residential settings, I should say, where, you might more regularly work with students along given routes. Sometimes just having a ready supply of detailed Tmaps can be useful. So again, I'll put some of this contact info into the chat. that's it for my segment, and I'm going to transition over to Jennifer, but I'm happy to take any questions that may have arisen. Is anyone aware of any? I haven't been monitoring the chat.
Haven't seen any questions come through the chat yet. I also want to know if you were interested in doing the poll.
I am interested in doing the poll, and I totally forgot about doing it. And now that I'm sharing my screen, I don't seem to be able to access.
You might want to
stop my share.
stop your share.
I will stop my share. Hi, everybody. I'm back. You know what? I did have a couple poll questions I wanted to run by you folks. And that is to learn a little bit about your tactile production methods if you use them. So I'm going to launch this first question, which is about software. What software do you use for printing and embossing tactile graphics? And it's multiple choice. I love the plethora of responses that are, I don't know, I haven't used any software to create tactile graphics. In which case, Tmap could potentially be your entree into the world of tactile graphics. Well, 11 out of 14, that's pretty good. So I'm going to end the poll because I'm guessing that maybe some of those in the 14 are us. And there was another question, which I'm just going to ask. It might not be applicable now since so many people have admitted that they don't produce tactile graphics. But how will you be printing or embossing the maps? Again, PDF and SVG are the two maps, or the two map files, I should say. Okay. So 78% say they use, 80% say they use embossers, and 30% use microcapsule or swell machines. And I guess we're over 100% because you're allowed to choose both if you so desire. And then 10% don't have access to these machines. All right. Well, thank you very much for that little bit of information. I intend sometime in the future this summer, I think I will follow up once you've all had time to play around with Tmap with a webinar specific to tactile production. So we can talk more about braille embossers and swell machines. And as I mentioned, people can always order those maps from adaptations if they can't make them themselves.
It looks like Connie has already ordered 2 maps from adaptations. So thank you, Connie.
All right. Well, look, Jennifer, do you want to jump in and take over? I can switch back to the deck.
Yes, please. Thank you. Great. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for your participation in the polls. And Greg, would you mind muting yourself? Just so that we don't get feedback.
Oh, is that going on?
Yeah, you're getting some echo.
Thank you, Greg. I still hear feedback. I think I'm going to carry on. And for those of you who might have their mics on, please mute yourself. I'm going to keep my presentation as short as possible in the interest of time.
So are you in a headset or no?
I have my headphones on.
Okay.
There's no other. I'm sorry?
You might try reconnecting your headset.
I am having some technical issues just all around today. What might be good is maybe would Sarah mind maybe going forward with her presentation while I work on the audio aspect on my end?
I can do that.
Yeah, why don't we do that? Thanks, Sarah.
Absolutely.
Sarah, do you want to chat a little bit, see how your audio is going?
Yes. Is everyone hearing me without echo?
There's echo on your end too.
Yeah, I'm seeing that.
Oh, I wonder if Greg's screen share is picking up the sound. Is that a possibility?
Oh,
Oh, now it's gone. Yeah. So Greg, when you hit screen share, go ahead and uncheck that sound box. Maybe that'll fix it. I'm not sure. So it may not have actually been on Jen's end. It might have been that.
okay. I'm
Wait.
not hearing any echo. Is anybody else?
You sound fabulous.
Okay, Jen, do you want to try your portion?
Sure. Greg, if you don't mind backpedaling. Although, folks, if for any of you speed readers out there, I think there was my presentation right there. No. But anyways, thank you, everyone. I will get right to it. I am here from speaking from a instructor standpoint. So when can I use Tmap, right? What I'm going to do is just highlight a few key items here. And what I'd like to talk about is reinforcing an existing known route or expanding existing routes. This is an opportunity when you use Tmaps to present new information to your student to help them fill in mental blanks. And that's what Tmaps can do. Next page, please. All right, the rewards of Tmap. It stimulates tactile literacy. Students learn the language of raised lines. It promotes environmental literacy. So being able to discuss things like route shapes, patterns, whether that's grid pattern or campus pattern environment. It enhances spatial awareness. So being able to talk about streets that are parallel to one another, perpendicular, the location of their home in particular to maybe their local cafe. Tmaps can provide this type of information for your student. Next slide, please. Now, Greg has mentioned a little bit or alluded to some challenge areas with Tmaps. One of them is student mindset, an overwhelming, pervasive thought that maybe they're not a map student or they're not good with maps or good with directions. Certainly the need for simplification. I'll be showing very briefly an example of what we would consider a cluttered Tmap versus how to simplify that. The need for tactile readiness skills. So something Steve and Sarah will speak to, and understanding lines. And what I mean by that is that the line on the Tmap will represent the street so that actual walking on it would be, or one's travel on it would be on either side of that line. Next slide, please. A key aspect to note when introducing Tmaps to your student is adjusting your expectations. Recognizing ultimately that all students will benefit with a little bit of perseverance. Next slide, please. Tactile readiness skills emphasized for all learners, and this is across the board. Whether you have a student who is school-aged or an adult student. So some of those things could be teaching compass directions, systematic search and scan patterns, tracking, and specifically in relationship to tracking, that's being able to follow a line, remain oriented when it intersects another line or street, and certainly being able to reverse routes as well. And tactile discrimination. Greg alluded to the different types of lines that you may see in a tactile map, whether they're one solid line or a raised line. Next slide, please. Not one way. So what I mean by this is that teaching is fluid. There is no right time to introduce Tmap to your student. You can introduce it at various points in their program or drop it and pick it up again later. I mentioned that it can reinforce an existing known route, and it can be a means to develop new routes as well. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to speak specifically to customizing a Tmap on swell paper. A couple of tricks and tips that we've learned along the way is being able to use obviously something like a swell marker or Sharpie or even Uniball gel pens specifically to highlight maybe a main street or to mark X's on the map, using correction tape or correction fluid to eliminate extraneous lines, and noting that using a swell marker or correction tape should be used prior to swelling, okay? Bump dots, as we all know, they come in a variety of shapes and sizes, and they can be used to highlight a specific target area, like a specific building that you want to emphasize. Now, Greg alluded to the use of something like a PDF editor or a vector graphics editor. Now essentially, these are computer-based programs that allow for relatively easy removal of lines or boldening lines or adding buildings or what we call fills and whatnot. The advantage of using something like a PDF editor or a vector graphics editor like Inkscape or Adobe is to be able to save that creation and use it over and over again, so that a customized Tmap, it doesn't have to be a one-off experience. Also, with printing on swell paper, we found really good success with printing on a LaserJet printer. The toner contains a high amount of carbon, which really does a good job of making clean raised lines. And if you do or have access to a copy machine, use the bypass tray. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so the next couple of slides, I want to show you a couple of samples of edits that I've made. The edits will be two types. One will be what I call handcrafted, so using whatever materials you have on hand, and the other with one of the computer-based models, okay? So this is my sample edit number one. What you might see is a black rectangle at the upper left, and I've blocked out the address just to keep it safe and confidential. All right, so this is a street, or rather a neighborhood, urban neighborhood, in what we would consider grid pattern, right? The objective here is to accentuate the locate dot, which is the little small circle to the left of center, actually on the corner of Anza at 35th, okay? So accentuate the locate dot and Main Street, which in this case is Gary Boulevard, denoted by the letters GRY, okay? And add a building, which is the local high school. And that building encompasses, 4 blocks where you see the open space there to the right of center. And why? Because the student requires more tactile input. And these were the filters that I had on, okay? Next slide, please. All right, excuse me. So this is my edit method, my handcrafted method. I used a bump dot to accentuate the locate dot here. I used a swell marker before I actually heated it through the swell machine to accentuate Gary Boulevard. And I used self-adhesive, actually, I think it's foam, to create the local high school. Alternatives that you may on hand to do the same job would be using wiki sticks or puff paint or even dried spaghetti to accentuate, in this case, Gary Boulevard, or corrugated cardboard or foam board to create a building. Next slide, please. Previous slide. There we go. Thanks, Greg. So here I used a vector graphics editor program called Inkscape, and it did the same job, right? You see Gary Boulevard here accentuated. The locate dot has been accentuated as well, and I created a rectangular fill. Now, again, the advantage to this is I can use this again over and over with different students. Next slide, please. And here you can just see a side-by-side comparison of the original, what I created by hand, simple materials that I had at home, and then using the computer program. Next slide, please. Thanks, Greg. So here's sample edit number 2. And this is a map of a rural area. And as you can see, a variety of streets that are non-linear. Okay, a lot of curvy streets. This particular student lives in a rural area. And my objective here is to declutter and accentuate main streets for my student. Why? To demonstrate the relational position between major streets that this particular student really needed a strong handle on. And these were my particular filters that I had on. So note the clutter, the tactile clutter. Next slide, please. And in this case, I used the graphic editor, Inkscape. And I isolated all major and minor roads relevant to my student learning of environmental spatial relationships. And I deleted everything else. And I used different textures for each of the 3 main roads. And again, this is something that I can use for a different student. Next slide, please. Now I want to just, and so here's the comparison, obviously, between the 2. Now you can do this handcrafted, and what that might look like is using your correction tape or whiteout to eliminate all the other streets that you may not need, and then using different materials for each of your streets that you want to highlight. And there it is. Next slide, please. All righty. So a final word about editing Tmaps. You can use materials on hand. If you have the time, explore these other computer-based methods. As instructors, I think one of our funnest jobs is to get creative with our students. Another thing to note is don't forget to adjust the map legend. So whatever you change on the map, be sure to change on the legend, and obviously have fun. At this point, I'm wrapping up my section of the presentation here. I'm happy to take questions in the chat as well. And I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Sarah.
Thank you very much. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to be doing is presenting two profiles of 2 students that I have worked with using Tmaps, and so that you can see kind of how this all plays out. So the first student is congenitally totally blind, a route traveler, woman in her mid-50s, very experienced Braille user, very long history of O&M training. She had done independent street crossing. She had used tactile maps before, although nothing like a Tmap. Very, very slow to learn new routes. and extremely high levels of anxiety surrounding O&M. To give you an idea of where she started, the first time I worked with her, she took 6 months to learn 2 routes, one of which was an L-shaped route from her house to the dumpster in her apartment. Very, very slow learner, extremely high anxiety. And so that was our starting point. So next slide, please. So I had done some work with her on general spatial development, including learning to use cardinal directions, learning to use active echolocation, understanding object-to-object relationships, and then developing a plan for exploring new spaces on her own. She had made a lot of improvement in spatial awareness, and she had practiced orienting herself to new spaces, but always I had been right there with her, you know, within arm's reach, prompting her. Next slide, please. And then the pandemic hit, and just after mid-March or so, she notified me that she was going to begin a new job 30 miles from her house, was set to begin in the summer, and she needed to learn a route to get from her house to the new job. And so her normal commute was going to include multiple forms of transit, rideshare, Amtrak, and then a 2-block walking route. And it was the 2-block walking route that was causing her the most anxiety. And she was extremely anxious about the transition. And because of COVID, I could not be there right there with her. So we fell to Tmaps, and it turned out to be really rewarding. So I introduced 4 Tmaps. And next slide, please. Back one, please. Thank you. All right. So this was the first map. And this is, I will say, if I had known then how to edit a Tmap, I would have taken out some of the clutter because this is a very cluttered map. That I will say, for a very experienced someone who is tactily very literate, it is possible to make sense of this with guidance. She actually succeeded. There again, I have this past year learned a lot. But this was the kind of an overview map. It showed the Amtrak station where she would be arriving, and the paths that she would be taking to get to the job, and the job site itself. So it included everything, but even at the time I knew this was cluttered. So then I broke it down into some smaller maps. Next slide, please. So the first of the detail views was of the Amtrak station, and then the surrounding pedestrian paths, and then a few nearby buildings that I thought could serve as reference points. This was also prior to buildings being removed from the Tmap before we started having problems with them. And in her case, this was a fantastic thing. And these detail maps are what allowed the previous map to work. And so she was able to identify, I helped her identify that the kidney-shaped building was the Amtrak station, find the pedestrian path leading away from it. Next slide, please. And then this was the kind of the other half of that route, the pedestrian paths and the destination building. And again, so the surrounding streets and other potential reference points that she might need. Next slide, please. And so the other thing was that she had requested is that if she decided to use rideshare to get into work, she needed to know just the name of the streets nearby if she needed to guide the driver to her specific destination. And so I provided her with this kind of an overview of the neighborhood, just including the streets and the railway, because the railways were a primary landmark. So I left those in, but then also just the street names and the pedestrian paths, so that she would know the names, that she could learn the names of the streets just to recognize them so that she could better communicate with drivers. Next slide, please. And so student was able to use the 4 Tmaps to identify the overall direction and shape of the route, where the walking path connects to the Amtrak station, major streets in the area, and the relationship between the job site and then a bus stop that a friend had mentioned might be an alternative commute. So she was able to find those things on the map. And next slide, please. So the lesson setup was completely via Zoom. She had done Zoom before, and we had most of the bugs worked out. She had a little TV tray that she set up on. Wasn't ideal, but it worked. And then she had a tripod, and so she was able to position her camera so that I could see her hands and where she was working, and that turned out to be a perfectly sufficient thing. Next slide, please. And so after she studied the 3 maps, we did 3 separate lessons with the Tmaps. And then after those 3 lessons, her anxiety came down a lot. And then using the neck-worn phone mount that she had, we were able to do a Zoom lesson while she was traveling. And she was able to execute the route multiple times with minimal input from me. And there again, this is a student who was an independent traveler. I had worked with her for quite a while. And after that, she felt that she could do the route whenever it was going to be necessary. So for a student who had started with extreme anxiety, the Tmap kind of made it possible for her to approach this with a lot less anxiety. Next slide, please. So the second profile is also a congenitally totally blind student, rote route traveler. She's in her early 20s, and she is hoping to get a job working for customer service. Right now she's job searching. She is a Braille reader, and she reported, at the time we began, she did not mention this, but a little bit afterwards, she reported that she felt like something was wrong with her because of her O&M skills. And so next slide, please. So her O&M plan, so we started with an assessment of her spatial skills, and we started out, the first thing we found out is that she couldn't even identify this, she couldn't even articulate the difference between different shapes. She only had very vague familiarity with cardinal directions, no idea what intercardinal directions were, no understanding of angles, other than if you asked her to make a 90-degree or 180-degree turn, she could do that, but no understanding of kind of the geometry of what those were. And a very little experience with making distance judgments, and then little or no experience with tactile maps, and no organized plan for exploring new spaces. So the most telling thing to me, she said that after she had moved into her house 3 years ago, they had never rearranged the furniture, and she was still getting lost in the house in her own bedroom. And so that was where we started. So her overall O&M program was to focus on developing stronger spatial skills. Next slide, please. So before we could work on Tmaps, I knew that we needed to work on things moving up toward them. So I gave her a packet of 8 tactile graphics to get her ready for working with shapes, angles, compass directions, and tactile maps. The packet included 5 pages relating to basic geometry, 2 tactile compass roses, and then a simple tactile room map. So next slide, please. So this was those 5 graphics. The first, starting at the top left, is a circle with 72 points on it, and then the degrees for 0, 90, 180, and 270 marked off on the interior, so that the dots are every 5 degrees. So that the student was able to practice, I actually gave her some wiki sticks, and she was able to practice drawing angles. So I could ask her, draw a 90-degree angle, draw a 180-degree angle, draw 270. And then in the next graphic, top row middle, I had a graphic of parts of a circle so that she could see what does a quarter of a circle look like, half, the 3/4 of a circle, both on their own and then in relationship to a full circle. And then the next thing was rectangles and squares. What makes a rectangle different from a square? what happens if you divide that square in half. If you take a 90-degree angle on a square, divide it in half, you get 2 45-degree angles. And for these two, the rectangle and the square, I would have her take the wiki sticks and outline the square versus the rectangle so that she was drawing them. And then so she could compare, and it was the activity of drawing the square versus the rectangle that she was able to identify what makes a square, what makes that different from a rectangle. That later turned out to be very key for using Tmaps. And so then the last thing was bottom right corner is just a graphic showing kind of the relationship between a part of a circle and another shape, in this case, a rectangle. So next slide, please.
Hey, Sarah.
Yes.
A quick question in the chat for you.
Okay.
When the student was wearing the device to hold her phone while traveling, did she cross any streets? If so, was there concern about your inability to assist her if in any danger?
She did cross one street, and we heavily discussed before we did that. And again, because she was an independent traveler, she was very comfortable crossing streets on her own. And I made sure she understood. We had multiple discussions over many, many days before we approached a street crossing, that she understood that I could not help her. I would not see anything coming. And I was very confident before she did the first street crossing that she understood that. And I would not have done it with anyone that I did not know their street crossing skills very well prior.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the 4-point rotatable compass rose. So when we first started talking about cardinal directions with this student, first thing she told me is, I can't read Braille upside down. So what I wanted her to do was to get used to looking at the compass, not only with north as the oriented point, but what if south is at the top? What if west is at the top? What if east is, if you're facing east, where is north and south? If you're facing west, where is north and south? And so my initial thought was to give her, give her something and have her rotate the compass off of north. To which she said, I can't read Braille upside down. So what I did is I drew something that had 4 different shapes, so that each direction was associated with a different shape, so that when she rotated it off of north, and let's say now she is facing west, she doesn't have to read the W to know that the big flower is west. Later on, she admitted that she knows how to read Braille upside down and sideways if she needs to. She expected to fail at the task, and that was her excuse, was, oh, I can't do this. I just tend to route around things. So this was the rotatable compass rose that I gave her, and it worked beautifully. And it was actually really important as we started moving to Tmaps, being able to see what happens if north is not at the top. Where are the others? Next slide, please. So the next thing was an 8-point tactile compass rose. This, what I did here was all of the 8 points of the north, south, east, and west, and then the 4 intercardinal points also on this in one graphic. And then there was a second page, a key that had, so on the graphic here, we have just the abbreviations, N for north, NE for northeast, and so on. And so on a separate page, there was a key that had NE means northeast, and then the degrees associated with that, which is 45. And that turned out to be a good way that she could take in as much or as little information at one time as she could work with. And this was really important to helping her understand the relationship between the intercardinal points and the cardinal points. Next slide, please. So the next thing, since she had not ever successfully used a map, I created a tactile map of her bedroom based on what she had showed me using her camera and what she had kind of gone around her room using her iPhone compass and discovering which wall pointed north, east, and so on, and then where each piece of furniture was. And so I created a map to represent her bedroom so that she could start to understand, make that connection between where something is on a picture and where it is in real life. And so she was able to practice using this to describe the location of things using compass directions, and practice doing things like orienting a map to reflect, the direction you're actually facing, giving walking directions from one spot to the next, all things that you will eventually do with a Tmap. And so this was the last thing we did prior to introducing Tmaps. So next slide, please. So the first Tmap that I gave the student, there was a Starbucks that she liked to go to. She knew the area very well. And so this was the map. I gave her just a very simple street view. And so next slide, please. So what she initially used that map for was to practice tracking streets, identifying the sides of the street, exploring different block sizes, intersection shapes, identifying specific corners of an intersection. We discussed the address system, counting blocks, locating the even and odd sides of a street, identifying naming patterns. And so for her, this was a good, and she was fairly successful at this. Next slide, please. So the first roadblock we ran into is that she would scan the whole map to locate a street whose direction she knew, such as one of the main streets on the previous map was Texas Street. It runs east-west. She knows it runs east-west. And she would be checking the north and south, the top and bottoms of the map, to locate a street that the label would be on a left or right side. So with Tmap, your east-west streets are labeled on the left and right. North-south streets are labeled at the top and bottom. She's looking for an east-west street and scanning at the top and bottom of the page. So the solution in that case was just a continual reminder that east-west streets are labeled on the right and left. So if you're looking for something, where is the thing that you're looking for? Where is it going to be looking? Where is it going to be labeled? Where do you need to be looking? The next roadblock was wandering off the line while she was tracking. The solution there was just to have her slow down and remind her to stay on the line. And then the other thing, not doing what she said she was going to do. She would say, I need to go north, and then she would track to the east. So in that case, what I had her do was to verbalize what she was going to do before she did it. So she'd say, I need to go north, that's up. And then she would do it correctly. And then the other thing was using two hands to mark different locations. One hand would jump to the second location. So if she was trying to mark two different intersections, she would get one, but then when she got to the other one, she would automatically bring her fingers together, which I realized was a Braille skill. And so as soon as I told her, you're using your hands separately, you're not going to bring them together, that actually stopped. So next slide, please. So the next thing that she was working on was using WikiSticks to mark the location of additional businesses, practicing verbalizing routes between businesses, and then rotating the map appropriately to reflect actually traveling a route. And then the next plan was to identify other businesses in the area using the internet to search for information, making phone calls to get addresses of businesses, adding those to the map, and practicing recording route notes in an audio form so that she can travel them later when in-person lessons resume. And then exploring a non-grid area. And actually, since then, she has actually accomplished all of those things just since the last time I updated these slides. So once she was able to get those first few successes, made tremendous progress. It's like her progress just snowballed really fast. Next slide, please. So, and once we finished, after about 4 months, which included the geometry work, the cardinal directions, and the first set of Tmaps, I did a post-assessment and indicated that she had made substantial gains using cardinal and intercardinal directions, working with angles, and having an organized exploration method that now includes Tmaps. And also, the most important thing, she's no longer getting disoriented at home, even after she rearranged her room. And the other thing is that she actually expressed to me, I don't feel like there's something wrong with me. I just know spatial awareness is something I have to work on. But that gain in her self-confidence was huge. So next slide, please. And next slide, please. And so quick snapshot of how I use Tmap. I use it a lot to support the development of spatial skills. Orientation to a new area, absolutely. And then environmental and concept development, understanding what a grid area is versus non-grid, understanding intersection shapes, learning how to use the address system. Next slide, please. The biggest challenge working with adults is attitude. The number of adults who have started off their Tmap career saying, maps don't make sense to me, I can't read maps. Adult students will defeat themselves before they start. You have to show them how they can do it. So what I do is make sure that the foundation skills are solid before I introduce a map, and keep the early lessons really simple to provide immediate success, then build on that, the complexity once their confidence grows. Next slide, please. Most important skills to teach to support Tmap use: tracking. Tracking is probably the single biggest thing, is tracking lines. Also cardinal directions. If you do Tmaps without really working on cardinal directions, there is no great way to, it is very difficult to transfer knowledge from a map to the real world. Also working on object to object relationships, and then having a way to take notes for the student to be able to verbalize and record a route for hands-free use while traveling. And then making notes on discoveries if using Tmap to support real world exploration, having a way to make notes as they go. And next slide, please. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Steve.
Okay, hello everyone. Sarah's last slide is a really great transition into what I'm going to close our conversation by talking about. And my portion's a little bit of an odd duck because we won't actually be looking at or discussing any Tmaps specifically in this last section, but we're going to be talking about, as Sarah mentioned, those prerequisite skills in order to really be able to access knowledge from a Tmap. And as Greg mentioned early in the presentation, I don't work with adults. I work with school-aged youth at the Washington State School for the Blind. And so I love using maps to work with students in O&M, but found that for many kids, they aren't yet ready to put their hands on a map before understanding some of the foundational concepts that have been brought up already from Sarah and Jen. And so what I put together is sort of an attempt at a sequenced set of activities that will walk students through the process of learning those readiness skills. Next slide, please, Greg. So here we go. This, what's shown on the screen is an outline of the sequence of activities and concepts that I'm going to show a sampling of today. The three big kind of umbrellas are body to object relationships, map reading concepts, and environmental literacy. As I said, I'm just going to show a few examples from this sequence, but I believe Greg has the files of the materials that I have used, and then some teacher reference kind of lesson plan guides that accompany them, and we can make those available in the chat or after the meeting. Next slide. So the first activity that I'm going to highlight here is using magnets and a cookie sheet objects that most students have in their home to create a tactile map or representation of a room in their house. And we do this to start to establish some of the body to object concepts, like something is to my left or to my right, to the north, to the south. Understanding that students need to see themselves as a reference point on a map to then be able to place objects around them and make meaning from those objects. Greg, can we go ahead and skip the next slide and go to the video? This slide is going to demonstrate kind of the capstone learning activity that I do with students with these magnet maps, and it's probably the most important concept to reinforce before getting into introducing actual maps. And Greg, you'll probably need to switch the screen share back to sharing audio.
Yeah, I have to do that. We did that to combat the feedback we were getting.
So I will go on mute.
And let me figure out what I got to do here. I need to do that and that. And back to this. See if this works. Where's my...
This video is a short demonstration of one activity that can be done with a magnet map to help teach body-to-object relationships with cardinal directions. Okay, I've got my living room map here. At the top end, we've established that this little magnet indicates north. There are other magnets that represent the baby swing, the wardrobe closet, the fireplace tiles, and the pack and play. But for the purposes of this exercise, I'm most concerned with the 4 magnets in an L shape at the south end of the map that represent the couch. Next, we'll have the student place themselves in the map. I'm going to make this little figurine me and have myself stand in the middle of the room facing north. There we go. This way we can talk about all kinds of body-to-object relationships with cardinal directions. For example, when I'm standing in the center of the room and facing north, the couch is behind me. Now, here's the key part. Let's say I change my direction and face east. I'm not only going to rotate my figurine a quarter turn to the right, but I'm going to physically get up and move my body around the table so that I've also changed my orientation to the map. Now east is at the top and north is to my left. The sentence would now be, when I am standing in the center of the room facing east, the couch is to my right. Then you would repeat the sequence by having the student physically move their body to the south and west side of the map. This is perhaps the most important concept you can drill with a magnet map, so it's worth repeating the process for all objects on the map. We're used to looking at maps from one direction, north being at the top, but when a student gets out and travels, they need to have a concept of how their orientation to their surroundings changes when they change direction. We want to build this concept by having them orient the map to the direction they are facing. Later, this same activity can be done with a Tmap.
Okay, I think there will probably be an echo from me. Also, you all got to hear that I'm back at the school this week, and so our timing was our school bells there. It's a really obnoxious tone. While Greg is getting that screen share back up without the echo, I want to really kind of hone in on that point of having students actually move their bodies when they are looking at a map or like this magnet model of a room in their home. When we study maps, oftentimes we have that orientation where north is always up and in front of us. But students need to understand that when they're out walking in the world that north is not always in front of them, or else they're going to lose all of those concepts that they've studied on the map when they go out and try to apply those concepts in actual travel. So my first step with students is typically to have them face north first, and then leave the map sitting on a table, but move their bodies so that they are then changing their direction, and then their orientation to the map changes when they are facing a different direction. I do a lot of practice with that with students. That is a concept that takes quite a bit of repetition, oftentimes to sink in, but it's time well spent. Okay, great. Could we go to the next slide? All right, so after doing kind of some activities with those magnet maps, I move into some activities with a series of tactile graphics that start very simple and then get progressively more complex. My goals are to build tactile literacy, so things like tracking that Sarah emphasized is so important, and also concepts about what are maps, how do symbols represent objects, things of that nature. And to start with, the image that's shown on the screen right now is a very simple horizontal line that serves as our point of reference, moving left to right across the page. And an objective here would be something as simple as making sure that a student is able to track a single line on a page one direction, identify where north or south is in relation to that point of reference. So they could take a penny or a pen or a simple object and place it above the line or below the line to demonstrate that they understand those concepts of north of and south of. The next slide, Greg. And in this short video clip, I'm going to show this actually playing out with a student in a Zoom instructional lesson. So bear with us one more time. We're going to have to do the screen reshare, and I will go on mute.
Okay, can you describe for me what you find on this graphic?
There's a line with an intersecting line cross.
Oh, nice vocab word there, intersecting line. What is intersecting? What does that word sound like?
When
That might be a term we talk about a lot in O&M.
when they meet.
Where they meet.
Or they cross.
Yeah. So think about when we're out doing O&M. Where do we often go where two things meet or cross?
A street intersection.
Very good. Cool. So we could actually think of these two lines as like a really, really simplified version of a street intersection.
Mm-hmm.
Show me what your north-south street would be on this map. All right, good. You're following that line that goes up and down. Show me your east-west street.
This is the one going side to side.
Very good. Okay. Those blank spaces kind of in each corner of the page, those could be like the blocks that you would be walking on when you're out walking on the street, when you're on the sidewalk. So I want you to put your pen on the block that's in the southwest corner of the map. Very nice. All right, so bottom left corner. You nailed it. Put your pen in the northeast block on this map. Very good. Top right. How about southeast? And northwest? That was perfect, Sophia. All right.
Okay, so I think when we get back to the slides, Greg, we're going to zip forward through a few. The next slides just show kind of a series of these tactile graphics that are going to grow kind of in complexity as the series goes along. But in the interest of time, I want to move forward to a couple of graphics that show how we can apply some of these concepts of symbology and directionality and reading a key and whatnot into applying some actual O&M skills to these tactile graphics. So let's keep going one more, a couple more, Greg, actually. And one more after that. Okay, so the last two slides, one showed a tactile graphic of just a basic plus intersection. And then the one that's on the screen now is a more complex, basically grid with a few of the lines removed from the grid. So could represent kind of a downtown set of blocks, some streets going through, some streets not going through, creating some T intersections along the way. And so at this point in the series, we've gone through a lot of exercises, and I'm hoping that students are now ready to model going over some routes on this very simple all right angles grid that could represent a street pattern. So on the next slide, Greg, I've shown an L route and a basic Z route kind of overlaid on top of this grid. And so I'll oftentimes have students just like take an object like a penny and place it somewhere on their grid, and then another penny and place it somewhere else on the grid, and then have them, design a route to get from one penny to the next penny, describing for me which direction they're facing, counting blocks, when do they take a left turn or a right turn, and understanding that their body is going to have to face the direction that they're traveling on this grid. So again, these are just kind of a sampling of some of the exercises that can be done to build up those skills to be able to apply concepts using a Tmap to actual travel. Let's see, I think on the next couple of slides, Greg, we actually just get back into, these are very simple Tmap graphics. That is where I would kind of start with a student, but this is back to sort of where Jennifer and Sarah talked about with their presentations. So again, there's a lot of example activities and materials and graphics that I'm happy to share if anyone thinks they'd like to try these out with students. And I think Greg can put those files up as we're wrapping up here. And whenever we get done to the end of these presentations, I always lack a graceful way to transition back over to wrap us up. And so I like to turn it back to Greg to do the grand finale closing for us.
Like I have any kind of graceful wrap up. No, I don't. But what I realized is the whole time I was doing the screen share, I was of course not able to paste useful information into the chat. So I'm going to take a minute to do that right now. Some handouts for you folks. I put together a zip folder of things from the instructors you heard from today. It's right up on Google Drive. So this is the link to handouts in the chat. And I had also mentioned that to request a free Tmap user account, email us. It's tmap@lighthouse-sf.org. And I don't know, are there any last questions or anything while we come up to the 11:30 mark? At least 11:30 where we are.
And for those of you who want CEUs, I'm posting the link to the form to fill out to get CEUs.
Thank you for joining us, everyone.
And Bonnie,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the information.
Well, thank you. I hope it's useful. I just recommend for any of you, even if you don't have the ability yet to emboss these things, play around with Tmap, you know, try it out. And, you know, it takes a little getting used to, but it's basically a pretty simple interface and pretty simple tool, and you'll start finding things that work better for you than not, and coming up with use cases with any of your students and being able to map their various neighborhoods or places where you might want to do some lessons.
Well, it was very useful, very good information. So I appreciate it.
Welcome.
I hope everyone is able to get their free user account and start putting in some addresses. It's been such a great tool for me, I know, especially over virtual training.
And just so you know, it'll fall to me to add folks to those accounts. I don't think, if you put in your request today, I won't likely get to it until tomorrow, but I will get to it.
Yeah, I would like to request an account. I'm actually, I joined this at the last moment. I just found out about this. My colleague who was supposed to be here could not join. And so I joined, but is it possible that we could each get an account? Is that how that works, or?
And anyone who sends us an email to tmap@lighthouse-sf.org, we
Right.
can have an account. Yes.
Awesome. Well, you'll be hearing from a couple folks over here on the East Coast,
Good.
Pennsylvania. So
Nice.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
And Greg, if somebody is, you know, becoming a new user and, you know, has some questions or gets a little confused by how to do the process, what's the best way to get some support around kind of using Tmaps once they have their account?
It's in the handouts that I linked to is a list of resources. We like to steer people initially to lighthouse-sf.org/tmap. For those of you who joined late, that's some web pages at the Lighthouse's website where we post a lot of useful information about using Tmap and FAQs and how-tos. But you can also email us, again, at Tmap. There's a human being on the other end of that email. And as long as we're not too inundated with requests, we'll always take time out, you know, to give a thoughtful reply and help you work through whatever problems you're encountering.
Now that right there is teamwork.
I mean, I think officially we put the caveat that Tmap is unfunded and we don't have any tech support, you know, which gives us a way out if it ever gets too weighty. But I can't actually think of an instance where we ever left anyone high and dry. So.
And certainly I have been doing enough work with Tmap over the last year or so that I would be happy to throw some thoughts into if you get too loaded. I would be happy to answer questions too, at least on the from the instructor's perspective.
Well, and I
So
think
Larry just posted, Greg, can you put your presenter slide up again?
I think I can. I have to share my screen again, but yeah, I can do that. I can do that. Just gotta find the PowerPoint. Let's see, where was that at? Will that do, or do you actually need my slide? This is the keep in touch slide. I probably should have ended on that note. I too can be reached, by the way, at Tmap. It's not my personal email address, but I too can be reached there.
And we'll put in the chat the link to the slides again, which these should all be included in there.
Yes. Let's see here.
I just reposted that too.
Thank you. Thanks.
Great.
Yes, thank you all once again. I will be sending an email shortly.
Okay.
Thanks,
Have a
Norm.
great afternoon. Thank you. Bye.
All right. Well,
And Larry says thank you. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and end the recording.